Conference for 2021. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Maura Bellevue to the Administrators Conference for ACSP. I'm going to hand it over to you, Dr. Bellevue.
Thank you, Dr. Raja. It's such a pleasure to join you all today. And I know that I'm speaking to people that care deeply about fostering belonging in your programs, in your institutions. I'm going to talk at different levels of analysis, knowing that in this audience, planning faculty, planning administrators think all the time about structure and the larger social landscape within which you work. So I will take this down more to the institutional level and what one might say is the micro level to talk about some of the things I've observed over 25 years in higher ed in particular. I put up a historical slide here. On the left, you see the call for faculty diversity with a headline that, of course, is very awkwardly phrased that we would not see today, but this was 1988. On the right, what's circled is actually the headline when I was interviewing at Duke for a faculty job. There were all these outdated newspapers from about 6 months earlier that were arrayed in one of the waiting areas. And I distinctly remember while I was waiting to present my research on affirmative action and the psychology of affirmative action, having studied it in municipal organizations and having survey data from those employees in municipal organizations, that this was what Duke was in the midst of, that their major high-profile initiative that at the time had brought Clarence Skip Gates to Duke had melted down in the most public of ways. And that actually Duke was probably worse off for many years after that in terms of its diversity efforts because of the large-scale visible failure. And there are things that we learned at Duke in the time that I was there and that I have seen play out in institutions. In some ways, there are moments when I think in higher ed that it feels like 1995 or 1994 all over again. And other times where I see really substantive change through the lens of, as a social scientist, what's the causation here versus places where I've seen it not work so well. The agenda for today, I'm going to talk about some mechanisms to create diversity, equity, and inclusion change. I'm going to talk first about language, second about data, third about accountability structures, and then address, because I am an organizations scholar, what we have to think about when we're talking about organizational change. And I can't say that those of you on the call are all at predominantly white institutions, but across higher ed, it's arguably the case that most institutions are predominantly white that are R1 institutions and well-resourced. So if we're trying to change the institutions that have those resources and are producing research, then what are some of the things we can think about in terms of training and other mechanisms? I'll present a suggested partial roadmap. It will not encompass every resource at your university that you could call upon in your efforts, but I'll reference some of those resources and I'll present some final thoughts and some resources. So the first thing that organizational scholars take as a given is that organizations are fundamentally inert. Change is not the norm, obviously, and our institutions reflect all of the societal disparities that are fundamentally embedded in society, and they're replicated within our institutions. And that's part of the reason why higher ed, on one level, we think of it as an engine for transformation, but when it comes to transforming ourselves, our institutions are as inert as any other type of organization. We can turn a lens on some of the language that reflects and sustains those disparities in our DEI efforts, our diversity, equity, inclusion efforts. And I was really struck just this Wednesday evening to hear Barbara Smith, the noted Black lesbian feminist, who reflected on over the course of the last 6 to 9 months, the term systemic racism and the shortcomings of that term. And she has started to very consciously use the term white supremacy. rather than systemic racism, making the point that when you talk about systemic racism, in some sense, you're creating an impersonal term that doesn't take into account how our own personal choices perpetuate that system if we are in fact white Americans. And so she believes by saying white supremacy, that captures what we normally talk about when we say systemic racism, but it puts the onus on us to recognize that if we are white Americans, we are deriving the benefits of that system. It's not this othered system that we have no direct participation in. I'd also say in the DEI domain, it's really interesting to see how terms create otherness. So people are othered through the simple language we use. A good example is we talk about minorities in organizations, students, faculty, staff. That's meaningful because numbers in fact drive so many sociological and psychological processes. So to give you a quick example, in a classroom, a Black student who might be one of say 3 in a class of 30 will feel both minoritized and be numerically in the minority in that class racially. When someone is in the minority, they do draw excess attention. So I've observed this my whole career in the classroom, that a Black student who asks a question, often a very astute question that other students should be asking, that question is scrutinized through the lens of how does that question reify and reinforce a stereotype that white students have of the Black student as somehow not as adept at the subject matter. So the notion of stereotype threat is triggered when a student is particularly in the minority and aware that the other students hold a stereotype and that they could reinforce it through their behavior. So the numbers matter and the numbers need to change, but organizations also very effectively, unfortunately, minoritize people using language and processes that make them feel othered. So there are certainly departments that have more or less minority students, but the processes can be just as damaging where numerically there's better representation. Inclusion is a term that also has the potential to create this otherness through language. So I have colleagues who, we all started using the term inclusion decades ago, and there was no discomfort or concern about it, because as organizational scholars, we think of group composition generally. So when we're talking about inclusion, we're talking about all the processes psychologically and sociologically that create openness to everyone's contributions. Now, when institutions talk about inclusion, there's usually a default idea of who's already included. And that makes the term inclusion challenging if you don't frame it through the lens of we're talking about it in terms of how do we make our group open to all forms of influence, and making sure that there's optimal participation and opportunities for all to participate. And sometimes that means for majority group members, that means stepping out a little bit to create space for anybody else in the group. And that's a rather novel idea in most department meetings, where people don't think about creating space for others necessarily, especially when it's a highly charged environment. So what does inclusion mean for majority group members? It should mean my role is to make that group as welcome and opening and inclusive of contribution as possible. Not that I belong fundamentally and someone who's a different race does not belong, which is how inclusion sometimes gets used. So when we examine the language, I want to go back to 1994 when affirmative action was openly discussed. The reason I want to reference it is most of the DEI policies we have in the academy are extensions of or consistent with affirmative action, and they are as misunderstood as affirmative action is and was. So given those roots, I want to briefly say the language that people used previously about affirmative action remains problematic. One of the things that when I was doing my dissertation on affirmative action, I found really fascinating is that psychologists, we knew as we looked at the data, that if you did a two-stage survey of people about affirmative action, you get some very interesting results. If the first stage was in essence a quiz about what affirmative action is, and the second portion was how do you feel about it? What are your attitudes? It turns out that people who were very opposed to affirmative action were also failing that quiz. They were not actually responding in terms of their opinions and attitudes to what the policy actually was. They had these mistaken notions that affirmative action meant quotas, that affirmative action in all cases meant preferential treatment, and they also believed it meant strong form preferential treatment. So let me just stop there for a moment. So quotas would mean that there is a hard and fast number of, let's say, Native American faculty, Black faculty, Latina faculty that must be hired. And quotas do exist under affirmative action, but only in one circumstance. If an organization of any type has been found to be actively discriminatory in a way that quotas are required just to balance the scales because the discrimination has been determined by the courts to be so egregious. Most affirmative action is never tied to quotas. That's one thing. Preferential treatment is actually only one mechanism through which affirmative action could operate. And most of the time, affirmative action actually consists of extensive outreach and recruitment, not preferential treatment. It can include preferential treatment, and here's what's legally allowed. Preferential treatment that's illegal in the academy or any place else under affirmative action involves what can be called preference for qualified applicants. So it means you can never use race and say, we'll hire someone who actually doesn't have the qualifications for this role, whether it be staff or faculty. But if you have underrepresentation, and this is another key ingredient. So if you know you are currently not diverse relative to what the pool of talent has been demonstrated to be, that suggests implicitly there's a problem. And you're allowed to use preferential treatment, meaning you can actually give the nod to a person of color in that circumstance who is from a group that's underrepresented. So it could be a Native American person, and you could say that, okay, we know what the number of PhDs in our field is. If it's history, we know that we should have X number of tenure faculty if we are doing effective recruitment and outreach. That's weak form preferential treatment. That's typically what happens. But if you're effective in outreach and recruitment, you don't even end up at that place. Universities typically have affirmative action plans. They involve the goals for the institution, which means where there is an identifiable talent pool of eligible individuals for the jobs that the university has, and yet there's underrepresentation, there's underutilization of that talent pool is the technical term, then the institution should be taking affirmative action because there's something that's not happening in recruitment and outreach. There will be goals in those cases, which are not the same as quotas. And you will hear provosts state goals, which are meaningful because goals mobilize action, but they are different from quotas in that quotas say you must do it and you will do it, versus goals say we will make every effort to do it. And when you have publicly stated goals, the psychological research shows that people actually reorient their thinking and their action to try to achieve the goal. It doesn't mean that anyone will be, that does incredible outreach and recruitment and falls short of having qualified candidates in the pool, that then they're going to hire someone who is not qualified. That would actually be counter to affirmative action law. So why do I talk about this? Because the debate about affirmative action that was in some sense never resolved because individuals who knew what affirmative action really was were not the loudest voices in the room. I'll give you a quick example. When I was at Berkeley, there was a great economist who had been instrumental in doing some of the most rigorous research on affirmative action policy and its effects. And his name is Jonathan S. Leonard. And Jonathan showed that counter to the narrative in the public press, and remember, this is before we had some of the completely alt-fact outlets that we do now. This was in the 80s and 90s. He was looking at the data and showing we are having the effects you would expect if affirmative action was being followed legally, which is there are slight changes in the demographic composition of organizations, indicative of enhanced outreach. But there is no widespread, wide-scale job loss for white males, which was what was being argued. So the white male backlash against diversity efforts, specifically in the form of affirmative action, was not supported by the data on employment, nor the data on organizational performance, which would suggest that if institutions were hiring less qualified individuals because of affirmative action, then we should actually see them underperform. None of that was true, suggesting that it was outreach and recruitment and weak form preferential treatment where there was existing evidence that people were previously giving the nod to the white male consistently. So I highlight that because that story didn't get told. And one of the reasons that story didn't get told became clear to me in a way that as a junior faculty member was very disturbing. I just finished my dissertation. Jonathan got a call from some journalists. Affirmative action was a hot topic in the press. And he said, you should talk to my former student who's now at Duke. And so I got a call from a journalist, and this very earnest journalist asked me all kinds of good questions. And most of them were negatively framed, like, doesn't it hurt white males? Doesn't it reduce performance? Doesn't it do this? Aren't people uniformly opposed? And I was sort of no, and then the data, no, and then the data. And then there was a long pause. And at the long pause, she said, well, it's interesting. Every academic I talk to that studies affirmative action is telling me what you're telling me. But my editor wants a story that says this is the form of diversity policy that hurts white males and hurts institutions. And we never got past that. So now the affirmative action debate is oftentimes about student admissions, but it remains that faculty, in my view, I give sessions and I hear things like people have never seen an affirmative action plan. They don't know what utilization analyses look like. And so what ends up happening is we have diversity initiatives and we don't label them affirmative action, but they in many ways pick up the mantle of affirmative action, which is we should be looking at the National Survey of Earned Doctorates and all the pools of talent for the degrees that are necessary to be in planning colleges. Sorry, that's Teddy. Planning colleges and every place else, right? And we should be conversant in that data, because if we don't know that data and we don't know what the actual pool is, we don't really know how we're doing. So my first bit of advice is to think about the language. Look at the language, look at how you talk about diversity and inclusion, look at how people talk about or reference affirmative action. The second thing is frame the problem with your institution not as diversity. If people talk about it as if diversity is the problem, or even if they talk about it like lack of diversity is the problem. I like to think of it and confront people with this. The real problem we have in academia and organizations in general is pervasive homogeneity, and what Rosabeth Moss-Cantor called homosocial reproduction. How white male majorities in organizations, particularly in corporate life, but it's true in higher ed as well, have largely succeeded in reproducing themselves. So I'm talking to planners who think about innovation and creating environments that stimulate innovation. So the idea that sameness is not good for much of anything is clear. But if you think about educational institutions, I want you to turn your lens that you use in your field and think about the institutions and say, why are we talking about diversity as the problem? Because frankly, if I was an African-American student and I heard that language, I would care about diversity, but I would much rather see people turn the lens and say, why is no one talking about the pervasive sameness, that there is overwhelming whiteness in given units or departments or groups? How did we end up there? Because that suggests it's not a coin flip among qualified individuals. It's an obvious advantage being given on a routine basis. Or we're not willing to go out into the larger world, and we're going to the same environments, the same networks, which we already know are white. So if we recruit faculty or students or anybody else through the networks of who's already in the institution, our networks across all races tend to be structured to be more like us. Now, white folks tend to have more white networks than people of color, because if people of color are in higher ed, they are confronted with the whiteness of higher ed, which requires their networks to be what we call heterophilous, whereas white people often get by with white networks. I'm going to show the resources at the end, but this is my late friend, Kathy Phillips. She died tragically about a year ago, and Kathy was one of the smartest people on diversity. I couldn't go to a public talk that people weren't citing her research, almost in any field. And she wrote a Scientific American piece that really makes this case about the problem of homogeneity by citing how it's not just that the diverse individuals, as I've heard at least one dean talk about diversity, which is not the way you want to talk about diversity. It's not just that the diverse individuals make groups smarter by bringing new perspectives. It's that the presence of diversity within a group stimulates the majority group members to think actually more richly and deeply and draw on more sources. And so that literally in the group process literature, it's called minority influence, and how anyone who presents a minority view can trigger the otherwise somewhat reductive majority to think in more divergent and creative ways. So our societal disparities sustain diverse disparities within the academy, and we need to start asking, why is this pervasive sameness, and framing homogeneity and the omnipresence of majority group members as a problem. I would also say that one of the issues of homogeneity, which is really interesting, is in homogeneous groups, people rate the group as higher performing, and that's because they experience comfort. So when you have experiments and you have metrics, so you know the actual performance of the group, it's clear that homogeneous groups think they've really performed well. And some of this research has been done with student teams in graduate programs. And because it was comfortable, they think it, and low conflict, they think that they were really innovative and high performing. And in fact, the objective data shows that they are not. And so they read comfort as quality, which is a major problem in all institutions. So we have to think about how higher ed institutions can lead societal transformation, but how can we possibly do that if we're not constantly also engaging in the self-examinations of how we prioritize fundamentally majority group comfort? I'm speaking to people that know more about place and space than clearly I do, but there's also fascinating research on how spaces get coded as white. And I've talked to people at the University of Buffalo, and I don't want to reveal where these spaces are because these were private conversations, but there's a lot of concern about how people can try to create as staff and faculty what they think of as a neutral and an open space, and somehow that space gets coded as white. And once it gets coded as white, it isn't utilized by all students the same way. So we have to think about how do we create spaces that maximize the interaction. And honestly, if students gravitate to high comfort and high sameness, That's going to be a perpetual challenge. The other place to look through language is obviously ARPT. We all know that. The tenure guidelines have to be examined through a DEI lens. But I'm going to raise something that is striking to me, which is that university communications people have style guides. And those style guides can themselves be biased. One example at UB, and I'm raising this on a regular basis and not getting terribly far, is that doctor as a term is dropped. In the style guide, it's not considered appropriate to call someone a doctor. Now, if someone's name is appearing as a guest speaker, a big name from Columbia, and they're Stephen Johnson, people might presume that's someone with a doctorate. But I find it very problematic to drop doctor when we have faculty of color, women, indigenous faculty, because their doctorate is always erased. And I'll talk about more about that in a moment. But I would encourage you to look at the style guide and actually talk to your communications folks within your school about how they do or don't provide these honorary nods, if you will, but they're earned degrees. And when we eliminate them from certain groups where we know societally that it's already going to be attributed to other groups, it really perpetuates disadvantage. Another point, present the data. I will give the example of when I came into Duke, there were 12 of us who were hired, 6 of us were rookies, and we all knew the business school had a very poor record at the time of tenuring rookies. So people would go and they would leave, and that was kind of considered normal. And there was a not very effective associate dean who was part of the DEI problem for the school at the time. And at a going away party for 6 of us that were all juniors, that were all getting good jobs and leaving, and we all got counter offers, but we weren't interested in staying. He was saying to me how great it was because he had just had a great recruiting season. And his secretary, who I loved, said, but naming him, you're forgetting, you're losing 6 people today. You just brought in 5, you're losing 6. Do the math. And that is such a common problem for administrators. It's always the hiring game. It's rarely, even if people think there's a revolving door, ask them to tell you the numbers of how many people have left by group, by rank each year in your institution. And the same people that are touting their success in hiring will probably not be able to tell you the retention numbers. Now, I will say that's very different when you have unit diversity officers like Dr. Raja and others who pay attention to these things. But I will say you want every dean, every associate dean, and you want the leadership in your central administration to be focused on these data as well. I mentioned the availability data. That's coming from the affirmative action plan. There are institutions who make their affirmative action plans public, others don't, but you can request those and you can see how they're calculating under utilization. That's a great place to look. You also want to ask questions about how institutions require a recruitment plan before you were given the opportunity to hire, before you go out and place an ad. I've had people say how great it is because searches were stopped after they weren't diverse. And I've said, why was there even a search to begin with if there wasn't a rigorous recruitment plan to ensure there would be diversity? That's really the first step. And of course, you also should be stopping searches if you did have a rigorous recruitment plan, but for some reason you were not getting the expected diversity in your pool. Is the ad vetted, not just centrally in HR, but in your group for appropriately neutral and welcoming language? I have examples of this that I can share that when I do trainings, I put them up. There was an NYU department that had really elaborate language about all the resources and things that would be available, but lots of institutions are going the extra mile. It is not the boilerplate, affirmative action, EEO, etc. We welcome veterans. It's here's our commitments to diversity right in the ad. Another progressive step some institutions are taking, and I think especially for new doctoral students who are not the children of academics or have been under-mentored at their institution. It's really critical to talk to your HR folks about the online job system and how that can be a barrier. I talked to some colleagues at an institution that I think does diversity quite well, and they said that they worked quite a bit on this, and they now have, it actually will show if you need help navigating the online job system, which often looks like a tax form times 3 in terms of unpleasantness, you can call this number in order to get through for someone to help you navigate the system, answer all your questions, etc. It's a barrier for a lot of first-gen faculty, I really believe, across the board. And that support makes a difference. In my experience, persuasive analyses for faculty, this is one that I use over and over, and it kind of makes jaws drop. I talk about the student of color to faculty of color ratios in my institution compared to the white student to white faculty ratios. So at my institution, I actually was leading a committee meeting, and I asked people to guess what the ratio of Black undergraduate students was to every Black tenure track faculty member. And no one came anywhere near 55 to 1. And once I presented 55 to 1, people halved it and said for white students, maybe 25 to 1. And for white undergraduate students, it's 12 at UB. So for every 12 white students, there's 1 tenure track faculty member. And for Black undergraduates, it's 1 Black tenure track faculty member. And when you're talking about mentoring and availability of role models, people get it, that's very problematic. So I mentioned availability. I would also recommend step analyses, which many of you may do with the hiring systems you already have, which are your way to see the diversity that you have at each stage of your searches, your initial pool, the group that you phone interview or Zoom interview, and then if you do campus interviews, of course, everything is Zoom these days, but you can look at every step and see where are we losing our diversity and what might be going on. Exit analyses are often done, but not done very rigorously. So let me just say a little bit about the data and how to get better data on exit interviews. When people leave as faculty or staff, they should be interviewed about their experiences. That's what an exit interview is. Organizational research suggests that people are far less honest about their reasons for leaving at the time of exit than 6 months later. So those exit interviews, particularly if you know you have diversity problems, should be done twice. Once at exit and once 6 to 9 months later. When people are exiting, they give the easiest reason frequently. Now, not always. Some people really do want to say what was wrong about the institution. But 6 to 9 months when they're settled into their new job, they're much more willing to be candid about all of the problems. And candor is one of the most essential ingredients to DEI. So an institution that is a culture where there's low candor, you're really not going to get very earnest responses at exit because there's no history of people listening to that. Accountability for the data is also critical. So this is where the rubber hits the road. You might think, well, I'm the diversity person or I'm on the diversity committee and I see the data. And it's really important that you do. But again, because at higher levels, leadership is often fascinated and really convinced hiring is going to make the difference. So I think every dean ought to have that snapshot in their head. I think every program director has to have the snapshot in their head. And the snapshot can look just like EEO6 data, but it would be for a higher ed institution, the job categories would be a little bit different. But think of an Excel spreadsheet where in one page, you see columns that represent gender and racial ethnic diversity, and on the rows you're seeing ranks and job types, and at the bottom you're seeing totals from the previous year and the totals this year. So you can see, in a sense, for every group, did we lose people such that our numbers went up or down in hiring, and how did it relate? It's a snapshot, it's simple, but here's why I advocate for it. I actually did a paper in 2017 with EEOC data where we had 2,000 establishments and some 81 large corporations. So picture a company like Target. Every Target store is an establishment. So picture your university, every department, in a sense, every unit is an establishment. Every department could be an establishment. You do a breakout demographically. Now, we controlled, we did multi-level analyses and every possible variable of control to explain changes in women's representation. We did lump across race and ethnicity because of the lack of variation in women in management in general. There weren't huge numbers per establishment, but we wanted to see change over 4 years. So we had a starting point and an ending point. We controlled for everything imaginable that would predict like things like pipeline, things like public diversity statements, et cetera, et cetera. And my hypothesis, which proved to be correct, was that the EEOC doesn't tell people who has to look at that data. There is a snapshot. It looks just like the Excel spreadsheet that I described. Major companies typically have EEOC reporting requirements. They have to turn in this form. They turn it in by establishment, and then they turn in an aggregate form for the corporation. The EEOC never thought to dictate what level the person has to be at who signs that form. So our data set, it was really clear there was tremendous variation. Sometimes it was an HR secretary, sometimes it was an HR vice president, sometimes it was legal counsel, and sometimes it was a chief officer of the institution. What we found was that controlling for everything that should have wiped away the effect, the simple status rank of the person who took responsibility for looking at that data predicted 4 years later the percentage of women in management. There was an 8% increase after controlling for pipeline, diversity commitments, whether there was a chief diversity officer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and whether the company grew or not. Accountability for the data, seeing it and taking responsibility. There is no substitute. And whether you're a unit diversity officer or not, you need to engage all kinds of folks within your institution to be conversant in what the data look like. Hiring doesn't solve institutional homogeneity, and there's something called the ASA framework that I think is really powerful. Everyone needs to do a culture analysis to create change. Why? Your cultural values are transmitted in everything. Your website, the campus visits, how people engage, what the environment looks like, meaning the built environment. ASA means attraction, selection, attrition. So what you put out to the world in terms of your values attracts and repels particular folks, leads to greater likelihood of who gets selected, meaning the people that look or feel or say they're consistent with the values, who are already attracted to the values you put out in the world. And then also attrition. The people that feel as if they are misfits. Well, the people that feel like they are misfits are the heterogeneous individuals. The group heterogeneity. And it could be based on ideology. It could be based on where they went to school. They're different, where they are from. There are all kinds of weird ways in which people can end up being perceived as different. But it's typically the different individuals who leave, which perpetuates the institutional homogeneity. A fact that many of you may know already is that heterogeneous groups, and it can be heterogeneity in terms of functional background, if you've been on a committee with people from outside of your unit, faculty in the humanities, the sciences, the social sciences, different perspectives can lead to ideological conflict, task conflict, relational conflict. Heterogeneous institutions are more challenging to lead. They're also more innovative. I think they're more interesting to be in. But leadership has to be committed to the work of not just creating greater diversity or heterogeneity. They really have to be committed to creating the processes for people to have the time to mesh and realize that they may have more conflicts they have to manage. Are they willing to do that? Is there the organizational capacity to do that? When I was at Berkeley, which I adored being a graduate student at Berkeley, we fought all the time as students. We weren't sure we liked each other. We were in seminars and like the debates were so intense. We actually did like each other. I shouldn't say it like that, but we were very different. I mean, as heterogeneous a group of graduate students as I could think of. Meanwhile, there was another school, I'll name it, Northwestern, which had great students, great faculty. They had a culture that you knew when you were meeting a Northwestern graduate student. I can't explain it, but there was a common look. There was a common way of being at Northwestern. Berkeley, you would never know. We went through the same program. We're very different, except that we were trained in very particular ways. And so I found it to be the most stimulating environment on earth. It turns out that from a mentoring perspective, because we were so different, in some sense, we didn't get as much institutional capacity focused on us. It was kind of one-off with us, which wasn't very helpful for us as junior faculty. Why chief diversity officers can fail to make a difference. The research actually from private sector organizations is that chief diversity officers don't make much of a difference. Why? Because they can have a coordinating strategic function, but a lot of the day-to-day work, the micro interactions, the kind of focus on the data that I'm talking about has to occur at multiple levels. So if you have chief diversity officers and you have diversity councils, for example, you will get the advantage of that difference. I've already talked about that research. I'm going to move on to how you transform the culture. Collaborative engagement and training are both tools. So the first form of cultural engagement has to be on the symbols and structures in your environment. What are we communicating? A wall of white male faces of past department chairs, university presidents, etc., making spaces welcome only for those who have been there in the past is not the way to move forward. We have to analyze our environment through that lens, and that's not, of course, something that anyone on this call doesn't already know. But we have to also look at the indicators of substantive commitment. And there we've got budgets being a major one, staffing. And we also have whether the culture, if it's not already a candid environment, there is no replacement for candor about where we stand now and where we want to be. And I often have departments ask me, because there were no diversity statements in the College of Arts and Sciences on departmental websites when I first got there. I said to them, to the chairs, I said, you know that there's really sincere interest in having more students of color be interested in applying to your graduate program. But if I looked at the photos on your website and saw nothing about diversity at the college level or department level, I wouldn't know that there's sincere commitment. So one of the things the departments did is they all created diversity statements, some of them actually with me, some of them on their own. And we grappled with things like what the embedded assumptions are in their field about diversity and its importance. There was so much variance across department, but they were beautiful and they were useful. And most of the best ones grappled with their current reality, not just where they wanted to be. Well-managed diversity committees and councils work. And you have to have that diversity expertise throughout the school, but particularly in the dean's office, ideally not siloed as diversity over here. I think one of the best positions for the chief diversity officer within a unit or program is whoever's in charge of faculty affairs and who would be capable of working very closely with the person with primary responsibility for student affairs. When women and people of color do these jobs, these important diversity jobs, they often get lowballed. That's beyond the scope of what I can go into here, but it's really important that deans know that if you lowball the diversity person, you cannot publicly say your top commitment is to diversity. And I'm going to now skip to some realities on diversity training and wrap up. Diversity training is getting bashed because people are misrepresenting what it was ever supposed to do. Diversity training was, first of all, never supposed to be done as a cottage industry, where people who didn't understand the social science and particularly the psychology of diversity and stereotyping were doing the training, but that's what basically has happened. So the first thing is it shouldn't be done by people that don't understand the science. And it also should never be done as a one-shot. I could not walk into one room and change everyone in that room any more than you can walk into one class, teach it, and have people, be transformed by that one interaction. There needs to be a configurational approach. So the way you do diversity training effectively, and I've really enjoyed working with Dr. Raja and her colleagues in architecture, is it's an ongoing conversation that is going on along with all the other work and initiatives that are happening to also foster diversity. So there are many things happening in configuration to be mutually supported, those changes. And it has to be communicated. So I've been so honored multiple times. The dean at UB in the School of Architecture has attended my trainings. I've had other deans in other schools do that to signal the importance to everyone. And, I'll be honest, training for faculty, people are skeptical. Faculty don't really think they can learn anything, especially from someone who isn't at UB currently a tenure track faculty member. But what I've been told afterwards is, and it's kind of amusing the way people present it, oh, my colleagues came back and they said your training was actually really good. It was like enjoyable. And I sort of laugh like, well, I frankly am not there to waste people's time, but that is exactly what diversity training can and should be, that people actually leave thinking differently and with some new tools. Awareness actually does matter. And the more you create a critical mass of people with that common foundation of understanding of what microaggressions are, what the tools are, etc., the better. The research shows, interestingly, that when you train people who are already committed to gender equity, for example, it still helps. Why? The awareness, the tools, the critical mass. And so it's, even if you can't get the curmudgeon to show up, ultimately, that should not stop you from moving forward. Eventually, I've seen curmudgeons show up, so it does help. And gathering people all together on Zoom, I don't do canned trainings because I don't think people go to them or watch them. I really think that when people stay on a Zoom and they talk and they see the other reactions and faces, it matters. And you have to have modeling by leaders. If you're doing diversity training and there's a leader who is doing everything imaginable that's violating the norms of what's going to advance diversity, equity, inclusion, there is no way to really get past that. So the idea of leaders being in the training is great, but it's also true that they should be modeling regularly all of the things you're trying to do around diversity. I've already mentioned the social sciences. There can be training that does backfire if it's not done properly. Mandatory training is hard in most institutions because there are union contracts, but I also want to mention that it can backfire because people that go there and feel resentful of being there, it trickles over onto the content. It's unhelpful. You want people to hear from colleagues that it was worthwhile. I assume everyone on the call has heard about what implicit bias training is, but I like this definition. A lens on the world based on, this is implicit bias, is a lens on the world based on the architecture of one's brain and the disparities in the social world. So we develop these chronically available schemas that we apply outside of our conscious awareness. They sustain the disparities. They don't, implicit bias is not the only thing that's happening. My favorite example is Larry Summers' explicit bias, where he made disparaging remarks about women in math ability. And 13%, that was explicit, that's explicit bias. 13% of the tenure track offers made by Harvard under his presidency were going to women a year before he made these remarks. After he left, several years after he left, 39%. So his explicit bias likely triggered some unconscious or implicit bias on the behalf of others. It also empowered others to exercise their explicit bias. I'm going to skip through these. This first one is just showing you on my trainings what happens pre and post. So people's level of understanding of implicit bias changes really dramatically. And that's knowing that people do oftentimes come in with some idea. I think this is really powerful that more than 70% of folks that go through the training either strongly or very strongly agree that the training has helped them understand how to be creating a bias-free environment. And this is sort of, for me, the most powerful takeaway is when people say, after this training, there's something that I've gleaned that I'm going to do differently in my interactions. And 70% strongly or very strongly agree. This is not a replacement for the institutional compliance trainings. I don't do sexual harassment training because there are other folks that do. I focus on all the other tools that often can fall through the cracks, even if you have legal compliance efforts. And I think a great place to start is when you talk about how diversity or heterogeneity makes everyone better off, which is this blue circle. These don't have to go in this order, but they kind of do work well clockwise. They build on each other and they create the tools for organizational change, which I think can be really powerful. Starting with, if you will, the diversity case, which may or may not already be made. One example of implicit bias training, and ties back to the language and practices, is that there's startling results of men when they introduce women at conferences. They use the term doctor for females that they're introducing. This is men introducing women. It's something like 40% of the time. And I can look up the statistic, I have it here. It's over 70% of the time if a man is introducing another man. Women, when they're introducing, they use the title doctor for both men and women at an extremely high rate, over 90%. So we build our practices through micro interactions and through examining these typically unexamined ways that we perpetuate things. The first closing thought is, the larger the inequity, the less likely people are to do something about it. And that is a social psychological reality, which comes up abutting with, we have to talk about white supremacy and these overarching structures that affect our institutions. At the same time, it can be very helpful to mobilize people to address inequity when we also find the tractable extensions of that large-scale white supremacy in our institution, where we actually have power to fix that, change that, alter that. Moral licensing means that progressive folks, a lot of academics, who feel morally credentialed, who think of themselves as fair and moral, actually discriminate more. So the reasoning is the psychology of discrimination. All of us are less biased when we're vigilant. So we need to think about ourselves not in terms of our moral credentials, but how we fall short. And then we will be more attuned to eliminating bias in our everyday interaction. We also want to appeal to other people, however, it's again a kind of paradox. When we appeal to others who we know are not on board about diversity or disagree with us, the more we appeal to their best self and remind them of their ability to understand and change and deal with facts, the more open they are to facts and the more likely we are to succeed. This slide has some resources which I can share with the organizers if it's possible to make them available, or you guys could take a picture of the screen, and that's probably the easiest thing, and you would have these resources. I have done research translations about a couple of articles that I've done, especially the engendering inequity, got a lot of popular media press because it was about women getting lowballed in the workplace, which I assume happens in planning schools like every place else. So these are some starting points. And I would also highly recommend the last book on this list, From Here to Equality, by the great social scientist, William Darity, and his co-author, A. Kirsten Mullen. I ran long, I'm very sorry.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bellevue. You gave us a lot to think about, and there are questions coming up. In the interest of time, I'm going to go to the first question that we got and combine it a little bit, and that may be the only question we are able to tackle. So the question came from, going back up to my chat. So the question is, do you have data or studies about pervasive sameness for academic administrators hiring? And how is it similar or worse than faculty hiring? Could you speak to that? And if you could roll into that, perhaps the role of HR in that process, that would be helpful.
Okay. I don't have per se studies of administrative leadership hiring in higher ed. I do have some ACE data on my other screen. This would be the data for college and university presidents from 2016. And about 58% of college and university presidents in 2016 were white men. About 25% were white women, and 11% were men of color, and less than 10% were women of color. I do think that search committees are getting better in having diverse pools at the leadership level, but I don't think that in 5 years those data have changed much. There are a few visible universities who have their first, for instance, president of color, but not any empirical evidence other than descriptive data. So no study on what is going on to cause the persistent lack of diversity in leadership.
Thank you for that.
Working with HR, I will just say, is probably one of the most challenging parts of diversity, equity, and inclusion, for the simple reason that a lot of the answers will be our systems constrain us. So it's not always a will, it's a capability. No one should take that. If they can use PeopleSoft to do whatever they want to do for their own reasons, I feel certain that there can be sufficient investment if presidents and provosts want it to make HR more consistent with the needs of units in doing diversity work.
Thank you very much. Dr. Bellevue has laid out a lot of resources for us, and I'm not going to volunteer her time, but I do invite people to show their reactions to what you have learned using the reaction button. And I will pass on via Donna the resources that she has shared with everybody who is on the call. And to her point, this is a continual process of learning and transformation for all our departments and leadership. So I request that you join me in thanking Dr. Bellevue for her time. You can drop in a note in the chat box. And we're going to transition shortly to the workshop. And before I hand it over to Rolf Pendall to start the workshop, I want to say that what Dr. Bellevue said about the continual process, and she showed us a diagram, our colleagues in the POSIT community, people of color interest group, and the committee on the academy is moving forward on these steps by preparing a workshop for all of us to consider attending on April 23rd, 2021. And I will shortly upload information about that workshop. It will be a workshop on tools to assess the climate for diversity within planning departments. And everybody who is on the call today is welcome, encouraged to join that. In that workshop, you will hear about a survey that they have conducted that has received 450 plus responses about institutional efforts, how they are received and integrated into urban planning programs. And they will be discussing a partnership between ACSP, POSIG, and the Committee on Diversity to administer a diversity climate survey for ACSP members. So please watch for this document that is going to pop up in the chat box. Well, looks like Donna has already done that. Thank you very much, Donna. So with that, thank you, Dr. Bellevue. It was a pleasure. And with that, I will hand it over to Rolf Pendall, who's going to walk us into the next step. And as you are listening to Rolf, for all of your health and well-being, I recommend lifting your arms and doing the little stretch. You can also wave to Dr. Mara Bellevue. And please show that you can move right where you are. We're not getting a break. So Rolf, over to you while I keep encouraging people to move while they stand.
So this is a workshop session meant to give you all a chance to talk to each other quite a bit more than we have over the rest of this conference. So I hope that you'll have a productive time. The agenda for the first part of this second part of this afternoon session starts with this introduction. And I just to read the purpose of what we're doing now, it's to learn from each other about how we can add belonging and inclusion into our business as usual activities as program administrators rather than another item on our long list of things to do. I know many of you would prioritize these kinds of activities anyway, but if it's a question of working them into what you're doing anyway, maybe you'll feel a little bit less bad because other things won't drop off that agenda. And I know a lot of you are already innovating in that way. Just a little terminology for this session, and I made this up, but it's based on my understanding of these two words. Belonging means the experience of people who are already in. And then inclusion is more about inviting people to come in who aren't already there, and also changing the organization so that it seems authentic and neutral and natural for the people who aren't in yet to come in. So inclusion isn't just about inviting you to a party that I haven't changed the rules of, but thinking about what is the party that I'm inviting you to. So that's what it's for today. After I finish this introduction, we're going to go right into small group breakouts. It'll be some brainstorms in groups of 5 or 6 people. We'll end at the time that's specified here with the brainstorming. Okay, so we're not going to end the breakout then. At that time, at 15 minutes after the hour, you'll have 5 minutes to pick one practice or innovation that you want to share, and more on that in just a second. You save all the notes and email them to me, and then more in a moment about what you do with them, with the items. And there's going to be 2 groups of rooms, the odds and the evens. And in order to have a little bit of variation in the kinds of ideas we hear, the odd numbered rooms are meant to deal with episodic but regular procedures. And there's a sample question here to get you going, and I'll put this in the chat. In fact, I'll put it in right now. And you can read them both there, but I'm going to put them in the chat. Chat is here. Except it went to Samina. Okay, and so those are the questions. Hopefully you've had a chance to read them and get a sense, but please take account of what the questions are. And the distinction is the things you do now and then, but you know you're going to have to do next year or the year after again, and the things you have to do pretty much every week or every month. And so that'll be a difference between those 2 groups. And then after you're done in that, what I hope will be about 45-minute period, we'll come back out at 20 minutes after the hour. You'll paste your practice, the one you want to sort of upvote or innovation, into the chat when you return to the plenary. The organizers, that's Lisa and Samina, and I will call on the individuals who submitted specific ones rather than going round robin and having every single person do it. And then and that'll be it. But after the session, we'll collect what goes into the chat. We'll also collect all the notes that get generated within your breakout groups. We'll try to have time to sort through them and think about what you've come up with. but at the very least, we'll provide the raw notes to all of you in the aftermath. So that's it for my notes about the session. Before we go into the session, are there any questions on the format or the setup? Okay, we're down to 34 people here. So you all are the hardcore. And I will share my email with you all at the end again, so that you can, or maybe I'll put it into the announcement to the breakout room, so you'll know who to send them to. So I think with that, Donna, we can start the breakout rooms, and that means groups of 5 or 6, and you'll end up in a room with an odd or an even number, and please do the relevant question to your number.
All right, I think everybody's back, and I think I'm up, right, Rolf?
Yes, you are. And the drill right now is that everybody should put your items in the chat.
So yeah, we asked groups to pick one thing, but certainly if you have other ideas, it's at this point a small enough group. We really appreciate everyone who's hung in there till I won't say the bitter end, the sweet end of this 1.5 day conference. If you're on the East Coast, you should be having your end of week cocktail now. So feel free to get that while you stretch, as Samina invited you to do before. But yeah, put some things in the chat, and these are ideas that you think we could implement. And I want to say, as people are doing that, maybe one thought that Samina and Rolf and I had as we were thinking about structuring the session, which was, and this came up in my group, the group that I was just in, was that this has been an extraordinary year. Some of the folks in my group were talking about severe budget cuts to their departments, having their teaching loads dramatically increased, losing adjuncts, et cetera. And so then also having this added work, even though we may feel very committed to it, is hard. It's a lot of work. And so when we were thinking about this session, we were thinking about what are the things that we could do that might be lower hanging fruit? What are the things that we could weave into these things that we all have to do all the time anyway? And so that was part of the spirit of it. Let's see. I'm seeing a lot of things come into the chat. So I'm gonna, it looks like a couple of you talked about how DEI could be assessed as part of an annual review and tenure and promotion. So I wonder if anyone who was a part of one of those conversations, Chris or Minghan, might want to talk a little bit more about the substance of your conversation on that front, and how those of us who have a voice in those procedures might actually do that.
Chris, would you like to start?
Well, I can say this came up towards the end, so it was not a major topic of discussion, but yeah, it is a criterion. It has become a criterion at UCLA, basically mandated from the top. And so people at other institutions were saying, oh, we had not done that, and had thought about it as sort of a framework for discussion, but not necessarily a criterion. And so we didn't really have time to process it, but decided it was an interesting thing to chew on. Is that fair, Minghan?
Yes, indeed. Just if you're talking about low-hanging fruit, if we hire somebody who joined the institution knowing that DEI will be part of the measurement, then no matter what, they will have to put in their scholarship and contribution. But we don't know how to do it. And MSU has taken steps towards including DEI as part of the annual review and promotion and tenure, but we are not quite there yet. So we are wondering, I mean, folks here, are there anyone who already have that experience?
Rebecca says that she has.
DI is a required element in our 30 review and tenure statements. There's a separate section that's required to talk about how your teaching, research, and service has related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think that's been in place for 3 or 4 years. So it's institutionalized at this point.
Rebecca, how have you seen that? What have you seen as a result of that inclusion?
That's a really good question. I just got tenure in 2019, so I'm not sure sort of what it looks like on the back end of review, whether it's just sort of something that you have to include or whether it actually matters in terms of tenure. It is something that we all have to reflect on as part of the process, and I think that part is really valuable. As a someone going through the process, it was really valuable to have to think about it and have to talk and write about it. But in terms of where it evaluates compared to everything else in the tenure process, I'm not sure where it comes in or how heavily it comes in.
Thank you. Anyone else have experience with this?
I actually raised it with one of my senior faculty members, and he immediately said, no way, don't do it in the annual review, because annual reviews are when you think about salary increases. And if you make inclusion, equity, diversity part of the annual review process, and then you make a decision on somebody's salary recommendation that appears to be linked to what your some appropriate line on DEI, then that infringes on academic freedom. He's one of the more progressive people in my department, but he's also a stickler for academic freedom and academic integrity. And so I was shocked. I hadn't thought about it before. But it's interesting that there's guidelines now at some universities that in fact, take the choice away from me, thank goodness, and would ask me to in fact include that within the review process. So it's good to know about this. And I think the University of Illinois' tenure and promotion guidelines might be changing in that way too. And remember also that we as administrators do have some power, at least of some voice, to participate in those reviews of what are the standards at your university, so that they do in fact give you the permission or the mandate to check on those things.
Chris, it looks like you wanted to come back into the conversation. Thanks, Ralph.
I wanted to piggyback on what Rebecca said, which is that, yeah, I think that the real status at UCLA is as a sort of a consciousness raising device. Yes, you have to think about this. You actually have to write something down. And as, if you will, a beachhead. I don't feel like there's a lot. I can't point to cases where it's like, oh, gee, here's somebody who was terrible on DEI and therefore they got dinged in the process. But I think, it's opening the discussion.
Yeah, and I think, we're talking about two slightly different things here. One is just tenure and promotion, and the other is annual reviews. And I think there is, as we all know, sometimes people really change their behavior after getting tenure. But having it then be part of an annual review would communicate that it's an ongoing value for the community. Anyone else have anything to say about that? Okay, so a couple of people talked about creating a DEI statement. And I think our last speaker mentioned that too. If somebody is going onto your website and trying to understand, I often tell prospective students, we're right in the, I'm sure all of you are right in the admissions process right now, which makes it hard to be at a 1.5 day conference. But I often say to students, I'm really glad you reached out for a phone call, because like our websites probably all look pretty much alike. There's not a ton of differentiation, and yet it's an important signal about what we value. So we talked a little bit about this in my group. I'm wondering if folks, if anyone who talked about this in your group could say a little bit more about it, and or if anyone else has a diversity statement as part, not just their school, but their department, and how you came up with it, what purpose you think it serves. Is it performative or is it really deep? Let's just talk about that for a sec. And I'm not going to call on folks. I'm just going to hope that folks, if you want me to call on you, put yourself in the chat, but also just feel free to jump in.
Well, I'll say that we have, it's not a diversity statement. We have a social and environmental justice statement. And I do think it makes a difference to the students who apply to our program. So in that way, it is definitely a very clear signal. And I'll put it in the chat, but it very much is us trying to outline who we are as a department. And in a roundabout way, it also, our students call us out on it. They say, we see this. And, I mean, once I was told, as chair, that they didn't think they got enough social justice in their core classes, which we feel like underlies everything we do. So we were quite surprised. But it was, but it's good feedback, but they do use it in conversation when they want to bring something up. We have this shared value. I want to talk with you about my experience. So I think in that way, I'll put ours up.
Thanks, Rania. Anyone else? Anne.
Could I say, the school has a statement, and we as a department, after a lot of discussion, chose to have an action plan rather than another statement. And it isn't quite finished, but it was sort of like doing a strategic plan. We hired a facilitator. We had a couple of meetings to come up with core values. And I mean, we're finishing it up, but at the moment it's gone to all our various committees, which includes some committees with students on them. It is more of a faculty thing, but it was because we thought Harvard has a lot of statements and we needed to have some more actions.
Thank you. I think one of the things, from my own experience as a chair over the last few years, I think we often think of these things as a way to communicate with BIPOC students or LGBTQ students, but I also feel like I've had an increasing number of white students sort of say, what are you guys doing about equity and justice? And so it's, to me, maybe this builds on what Dr. Beliveau was talking about, but it's about creating a kind of community, not just appealing to a certain group of students, I think. Minghan, you had your hand up, I think. Looked like you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, so I lost the train of my thought in a moment, but Anne was talking about, I couldn't, regroup my thought. I'm sorry. It may come back.
Okay, Marlon, is your hand up? It's funny. It shows right there in your USC thing. It looks like part of the logo.
Yes, and maybe an idea for a logo redesign too. Yeah, we went through a process on our faculty in 2016, 2017 that led to a commitment to weave social justice into all of our core classes. And so that's been pretty robust. We put it on our webpage, we audit our syllabi. We're beginning a process of surveying students. Did you see social justice in course X, course Y? We're building it into our learning objectives. So great news there. But then Lisa, I was taken aback when you posed the question, do you have a diversity statement? Because I thought, oh my gosh, we don't have a department diversity statement. So we have a lot more work to do. We were focused on the curriculum, and I think we may have had blind spots in other areas. So I was really struck by how, we haven't woven this into an overall department structure. So next week, I guess we're gonna start. And so.
Thank you. Minghan, you remembered.
Yes, thank you. It's about statement. I mean, certainly during COVID, at the time, and even at MSU, we faced the scandal of Larry Nassar, the physician who sexually assaulted more than 300 women. And the statement coming from the president, the provost, and the dean, so it's statement after statement after statement. Students are very sick of it. But staying silent is also not good. So what we did was we put our statement and we follow up in the school level, a town hall with all the students. So at a town hall with undergraduate students, there's one section, and then another town hall with graduate students, and take their idea and put it into actions. So that was well received, rather than just a statement on the website. I think you need to kick in a real action, at least to have some dialogue.
Thank you. Tara, I'm intrigued by what you put in the chat about ways of incorporating inclusion and belonging into agenda setting and meeting practices. Could you talk a little bit about that? I don't know if that's something you're actively doing or if it's aspirational, but I'd love to hear more about some concrete things you guys are doing.
I was trying to put the results from our group conversation into the chat. So I actually put it in two pieces. We came up with a few like tactics and we came up with that topic. So let me go back to the, we were talking about ways to, so in terms of ways to improve inclusion in sort of faculty meeting settings. So what are the issues? Well, you have a power dynamic that, you know, maybe isn't well acknowledged between the tenured and untenured faculty, and you have then those other social dynamics, the male voice versus women voice thing, the talking over, and those kind of other practices that are fairly common yet. So in terms of the topics or the tactics, we were just talking about, I think Gwen talked about how in Zoom meetings as a chair, you're more able to say, you're able to come back to the person who's been, you know, maybe talked over, which is, who knew there was something uniquely good about Zoom meetings? And I talked about using some of my agenda practices from like my nonprofit experience, bringing it into the faculty, like just having a more collaborative process of agenda setting. And then we kind of identified that, you know, as a group, we probably need some training in a whole set of skills like facilitation, meaningful land acknowledgement, and dealing with the fights, conflicts, you know, dealing with those kinds of conversations and having effective meetings around them. So that's kind of our reporting out on department meetings.
Thank you. Anyone else have thoughts about, that was one of the prompts, Rolf, about department meetings? I'm gonna go run and shut a door in my house because it's freezing, but I can still hear you.
So as I'm thinking about department meetings, how many faculty meetings had I sat through that were purely performative and absolutely not oriented to making use of the group? So when I became the head at Illinois, I was determined to have on the agenda those items that had to be on the agenda for decision. And while that's been effective and also very you know, disciplined agenda item control, so that if we have an agenda to get through, I guarantee we get through it before people have to leave for teaching classes. The result has been, unfortunately, that we've got so much business to do, especially this year, that I've completely eliminated chat time and just sort of the social lubrication that's necessary to build rapport and a sense of community. And the last thing I want to do is ask my faculty members to have another meeting just to hang out because they have young kids, because they're sick of each other, they don't want to be on Zoom. There's all these different reasons. So like maybe there's no solution for this, but I just wanted to share my sense of, you know, a little bit of discouragement that the choices that I've made have probably, they might be good for efficiency and for avoiding some really bad behavior. But we also have lost something in terms of group cohesion. Any ideas you might have about that? Jeff, is that you waving, saying you have ideas for it? Or?
I do, but to be fair, it wasn't my idea. I want to give it it's what we're doing in my Department of Architecture and Environmental Design. The chair is Rashida Eng, who just finished up a term as the chair of the Association of Architecture, the architect equivalent of ACSP. I always forget the acronym. ACSA, I think. Rashida built in at the beginning of our department meetings, our full faculty meetings, a 5-minute rolling check-in, and we have a break every 45 minutes. In our big department meetings, which normally which was about an hour and a half of business, we schedule them for 2 hours, and we build in at the beginning, in the middle, then at the end, spaces for just good news and what's going on. And we encourage people, because we're on Zoom, to not lose that. We say, put it in the chat. If you've got good news and things you want to share, just use the chat as those kind of side conversations, and don't try to squash the side conversation. In fact, embrace the technology to allow that to happen. And when Rashida started doing that after our second meeting, which was probably, I don't know, middle of August, because we've all been meeting ad infinitum since then, it's really made a substantial difference in terms of the collegiality of the faculty, that we were starting to lose it.
One thing I shared with our group that I was feeling really frustrated this fall about faculty engagement and faculty meetings on Zoom. Nobody ever shouts hooray when they have to go to a faculty meeting anyway, even if it's in person. And so what I've been trying to do for efficiency is move as much to sort of like giving people proposals and things they need to vote on via email, so that we can, and asking them to give me feedback via email, so that when we get to the meeting, we can do a vote, or, I know what the feedback is going to be. And then I've experimented a little bit using the technology to have breakout rooms to talk about certain things. And, circling back to the topic of this session, I think it's been helpful for getting the voices in the room of people who may not always speak. So junior faculty members, it seems like it's also easier. I was relaying to my group an instance where a female faculty member was speaking in this small group, and a male faculty member spoke right over her. And it was, I think, easier for someone to say, like, I think she was speaking. She wasn't done yet, right? And so, sometimes you can just kind of give up when you're in that larger group. And so I don't know if there's a way to continue that practice once we're back in person, but I think it might help with people who are feeling less safe to participate in a room of 20, to be in a smaller group. So again, maybe Zoom provides some inspiration here. I'm trying to monitor the chat while we speak, and I'm wondering if anyone else has anything to say about faculty meetings before we move on.
I have set myself a performance standard goal. I just want to share with you guys is that I often felt about faculty meetings before that I would rather stick pins in my eyes. And if I can keep our meetings above that standard, I think I'm doing really well. I hate information out meetings, and you either read your information before you go to the meeting, or you just don't get it there.
I'm just putting the name of a book, I don't know if any of you know, in the chat, called The Art of Gathering, which has changed the way that I think about running meetings. A colleague suggested it to me. Yeah, and information out, big no-no. Guilty as charged. I've done it for years. I want to ask Lucy, is Lucy, yeah, there's Lucy, hi. You're still here to talk about, you talked about both curriculum review, and I'd love to hear you say something about that. And I love this idea of principles of community, and I'm really intrigued by that. Would you mind sharing a little bit about what your group talked about?
Sure, yeah, we adopted them just a month ago or so with students. And the trigger for that was not really our DIJ effort. It was issues of neuroatypical brains, where some students felt badly treated by a faculty who's probably neuroatypical. And of course, there's privacy concerns, so we can't tell the student that this is what's going on. So we decided we would have sort of a document that everybody signs on, right? That says this is good practice, not necessarily you take Zoom calls in bed, we don't go in the details, but more the idea of collaborative and work and respect and learning from each other, right? It's quite general. We use some of the Berkeley language and some, we pulled away from models from around the country. But the hope is that when something happens in the future, we can refer to that. So that student who kept seeing the faculty as rude or disrespectful, now we can go and meet with both of them and say, well, which of these principles do you feel was not quite met in that situation? And hopefully the faculty can hear that and in our relationship with each other as well. So it's kind of, we all sign on to these principles. Hopefully every cohort as they join we're not asking people to sign, but to validate that they agree with that. And we can use that as a reference point. That's the idea. So that's for the principles that we've adopted. And it was with students and faculty. Our DIJ committee is made up of faculty and staff, and with students joining as well. And the students are reviewing the draft GIJ plan. So that followed after a review of our curriculum, which we're still in the process of adjusting. So we see it as a multi-prong. We're touching on lots of different things, but we have not touched on faculty P&T criteria at all. Well, actually, we hadn't thought about it. And we're not too sure we can give or deny tenure based on criteria that we can't really account for. I don't know. I'm not sure we're going in that direction, but I'm very intrigued in what that would mean in practice. So that's where I think the one from Berkeley, the university-wide, was the most useful in our models, but we adapted it, and the students were really leading that conversation because they have the vocabulary of 2021, right? And they understand what's the right keyword in the right place, I think, better than we do. So the students took the lead. The faculty took the lead on saying we need this, and the student took the lead on how to write it.
Thank you. I am.
Did you put a link to that statement in the chat, or to your own? If you could find a resource and either email it to me after or put it in the chat, that'd be great.
Yep, I'll do it.
Samina, Rolf, I feel like I've touched on most of the ideas in the chat. If either of you see anything I have missed, or does anyone else want to bring anything into the conversation?
I think one thing that I wanted to say is that the direction of the conversation, I've found it quite amenable and helpful because it's gone into the direction of how do we just build a caring community, as was part of the conversation last night, that our communities will be more resilient when we have a crisis if we've done the work at building community among ourselves in the everyday things that we do. And it'll make it easier to do the episodic things and say, well, of course we should continue to do these things. And we want to be creative about what else we do. So building a community that works for students who are having mental health crises, who are minoritized, who have disabilities, both visible and invisible. The same thing that works for all of us to feel like we have an inclusive community works for everyone. So I think that to me is one of the most important messages out of the last few minutes, that the things that make us feel light and feel affirmed will make our departments better places, will make our programs better places, and they'll make us agents of care and not just people who have the responsibility as if we're the superintendents of a large noisy building where we only get noticed when the toilets aren't flushing, right? I mean, it's like it's a model, right, for the caretaker chair, but y'all don't want to be that, and we don't want to have departments that run like tenements in the 20s unless you're on the Lower East Side and you're organizing for the revolution.
Deedon.
Thank you, Lisa. I share this in small group with Samina and Gwen and others. Well, what I learned with this pandemic is we just need to be more patient, more listening, because this pandemic also creates more anger, more division, at least in my department. But when you keep patient, that anger or that division, that tension that already there is stay there, it's not getting worse. I did, I would say, mistake one time, and then I respond when the division at the tension is high, and I regret that. And then after that, I learned myself, I push myself to be more patient in this pandemic. Of course, it also reflects with all other things, inclusion, everything else.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, you know, we're 2 minutes away from 2 minutes ahead of schedule right now. I think I would say, I noticed, Samina, one of the observations you had yesterday, at the time that you made this observation, was that everybody who was on in our Zoom rectangles was white, at least apparently so. That's not the case right now, but we're still a predominantly white conference and chairs conference. And I would just, with all of these ideas that have been presented by these, you know, our groups now and over the past couple of days, just encourage folks to take risks. I know for myself, I've also, I appreciate, Dean, you're talking about, you know, sometimes we just fall on our faces, but you pick yourself up and you keep trying. And I think our colleagues and students really know when our intentions are good. Even if the impact isn't always right, then you apologize and you move on. And so I would just encourage everyone on this call to try some of these things out. They may work, they might not, but you know that you have the support of your colleagues here. And I wish we could all check in before the next 2 years elapses and talk about the progress we've made. But I know that we'll figure out ways to do that as well. So I'm going to turn it back to Renya to close us out. And also just thank you all for staying so engaged after many, many hours of conferencing.
And I really don't have anything to close us out except for thanking you all for the work you're doing and being here, and certainly to Lisa, Samina, and Rolf for organizing this. And then also about keeping, you know, at the forefront of what we all are here because we want to do, which is, you know, continuing or working to really dismantle this pervasive homogeneity in our institutions, in our society, you know, and pervasive white supremacy, which is what, you know, certainly kind of led us on this track and having this session in the administrators conference this year. And certainly really appreciate the work and all your commitment to do that, and appreciate the time to be able to talk, you know, with you all as friends and my peers, to think through what we're doing and what we can do better. So yeah, so it's great to see 28 of us. Thanks again to Donna Dodd for all her work, just keeping us going on these last 2 days and leading up to the conference. So thank you, Donna, for that. And Donna did put the link in the chat, but it's also on your program. So please join us for a chat and a drink, an informal drink in Remo, any kind of drink, informal chat. And so, yeah, so join us there. And that again is thank you, Anne and Harvard for sponsoring that, but just an opportunity to have a little bit more of a casual conversation. And yes, hopefully see you all before, you know, definitely before the next administrators conference, but possibly in some remote kind of virtual event between now and the fall conference as well. But it was great seeing everybody.